ancient Mesopotamian tradition holds that kingship was a divine institution granted to humanity at the very beginning of civilization. The Sumerian King List, a cuneiform text compiled in the early 2nd millennium BC, opens with a bold assertion. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In this account, Alulim of Eridu, called Eridu in Sumerian, is listed as the first king, inaugurating earthly rule by God-given mandate. Alulim's reign is said to have lasted an astonishing 28,800 years, a mythically long tenure that situates him in the antediluvian era before a great flood. Such fantastical lifespans were not meant as history in a modern sense, but as symbolism. They emphasized the semi-divine status of early kings and the notion that the first kings ruled in a time when gods and humans were closer. Indeed, Assyriologists recognize Alulim as a legendary or fictional figure. His impossibly lengthy reign signals that he lived in a primordial epoch rather than in normal historical time. The figure of Alulim thus embodies the concept of divine kingship. Mesopotamian ideology held that legitimate kingship was conferred by the gods and could only be held by one person at a time, passing in succession from city to city according to divine will. Alulim, as the very first king, was understood to have been handpicked by the gods to lead. Notably, an old Babylonian tablet from describes the god's appointment of Alulim. He was chosen from among the vast and many people to be the shepherd of humanity. This description cast the king as a shepherd of the people, a common Mesopotamian metaphor for just and divinely guided rulership. The early kings in the Sumerian King List all reigned in cities sacred to patron deities, reinforcing that kings derived their authority from gods. Eridu, Alulim's city, was the cult center of the god Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh water, who in myth was the patron and protector of the first city. In fact, all known sources consistently place Alulim in Eridu, reflecting the city's paramount symbolic importance as the original seat of kingship. Sumerian narratives portray the institution of kingship as a gift from the gods to organize human society. Kings were seen as stewards of divine order on earth. It is significant that Alulim's very name may carry symbolic meaning about the state of humanity before civilization. In Sumerian, Alulim can be interpreted as horn of the red deer, or more generally, seed of the deer, depending on how the cuneiform is read. One interpretation by scholars is that this name alludes to a time when humans lived like wild animals before the dawn of culture. Sumerian mythic texts such as the debate between sheep and grain describe how, prior to the gifts of agriculture and domestication, humans were uncivilized and nomadic, clothed in skins, eating grass with the beasts. Alulim's association with a deer, a creature of the wild, may symbolize that he emerges from this pre-civilized, animal-like state of humanity. In other words, Alulim stands at the threshold between nature and civilization. By taking up kingship, with divine sanction, he begins to organize humans into an ordered society, just as a shepherd corrals and cares for a flock. Thus, in Sumerian belief, Alulim's mythical reign represents the moment when divine order, through kingship, was first imposed on the chaotic human world, initiating the era of civilization. Crucially, the Sumerian King List emphasizes that kingship descended from heaven. The Sumerians envisioned a heavenly origin for political authority. Order in human society was a reflection of cosmic order established by the gods. The king was not a god himself, at least in early Sumerian tradition, but he ruled on behalf of the gods, and some later kings would even be deified or called the offspring of deities. This idea of divinely conferred kingship parallels practices in neighboring ancient cultures, for example, Egypt's god-king pharaohs. But in Sumer, it took a distinctive form. Kingship was seen as a transferable office. When one city's dynasty fell, the gods could lower kingship again onto a new city. The King List is structured around this theological principle. It lists one city at a time as holding the royal mandate. After Eridu, the first city, and its two antediluvian kings, kingship passes sequentially to other cities, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak before the flood, and then to Kish and so forth after the flood. This schema presents a unified history of legitimate rule moving around Sumer, orchestrated by divine decree. In reality, many of these early dynasties overlapped or are purely legendary, but the Sumerian King List's purpose was ideological, to affirm that there was always one rightful king at a time, ultimately sanctioned by the gods. Alulim, as the first king in this list and the first ruler of Eridu, carries tremendous symbolic weight. Eridu was traditionally regarded as the first city ever built, and Mesopotamian law held it to be the original holy city where civilization began. By naming Alulim as the king of Eridu, the Sumerian King List ties the origin of kingship to the very origin of urban civilization itself. In summary, the mythic reign of Alulim encapsulates the Sumerian belief in divine kingship, the idea that the gods established kingship at the beginning of time to guide humanity. His story is not a chronicle of political events, but rather a theological statement about legitimacy and the necessary role of divinely ordained kings in bringing order to the world. Mythology aside, archaeologists and historians have long observed that the rise of centralized kingship in Mesopotamia was inseparable from the environmental challenges of the region. The land of Sumer, southern Mesopotamia, in what is now southern Iraq, lies in the vast alluvial plain of the lower Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This environment offered rich soils for agriculture. The rivers deposited fertile silt ideal for crop growth, but it also posed severe difficulties that early communities had to overcome. Chief among these were the problems of unpredictable flooding, seasonal drought, and a harsh climate, all of which ultimately drove the transformation from small village societies to more complex urban civilizations. Unlike the Nile in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates do not flood on a gentle, regular schedule. Mesopotamian floods were irregular and could be destructive. Heavy spring rains or snowmelt in the distant mountains could cause sudden river surges. The floods damaged crops, killed animals, and washed away houses if they came at the wrong time or in excessive volume. Yet if the rivers did not rise high enough, or if rains failed, the result could be equally disastrous: drought and crop failure in the hot, dry summers. As one account notes, the floodwaters were a double-edged sword. Whether they were too high or too low, they often disrupted agriculture. Early farmers in Mesopotamia thus faced a delicate balance. They depended on river water to irrigate fields, since southern Mesopotamia has almost no rainfall in the growing season, and the alluvial soil was fertile thanks to river silt. But without collective management, water was either too scarce or too abundant. Over time, Neolithic villages in the region learned that they had to work together to manage water. They dug drainage ditches and canals to channel river water to their fields during dry periods and built dikes and levees to hold back floods when the rivers rose. These efforts at irrigation and flood control mark the first steps toward urban civilization in Mesopotamia. Small, autonomous villages could handle simple canals, but the scale of water management needed on the open plain eventually exceeded the capabilities of any one little community. Canals had to be extended over long distances to bring water to new farmland. Levees had to protect entire regions. Crucially, water infrastructure often had to cross the boundaries of individual settlements, requiring inter-community coordination. As one historical analysis puts it, year after year, the floods varied, so farmers learned to monitor the unpredictable flooding and store food. It became necessary to structure dikes, reservoirs, and irrigation ditches such that individuals worked together, not only inside villages, but from village to village. This was the start of centralized power. In other words, environmental pressures necessitated cooperation on a large scale. Organizing labor for digging canals, maintaining ditches, and constructing dikes gave rise to managerial roles and hierarchies. Leaders who could mobilize and coordinate multiple villages' workforces naturally gained authority. Over time, these leaders evolved into the priestly and royal administrators of the first cities. The need to manage water thus spurred the development of more complex social and political structures, a key aspect of the so-called urban revolution in Mesopotamia. Environmental stress was not limited to water management. Paleoclimatic evidence suggests that the climate of the region underwent shifts in the 6th to 4th millennia BC as agriculture was spreading. After the last ice age, the climate around Mesopotamia became generally warmer and more stable, a temperate phase after 10,000 BC, which allowed human communities to flourish in the Fertile Crescent. But during the Ubaid and Uruk periods, circa 6000 to 3000 BC, conditions in southern Mesopotamia seem to have become more extreme seasonally. Sources indicate stronger seasonal variation, heavy torrential rains, and dry summers by the early Uruk era. In practical terms, this likely meant worse spring floods followed by longer, harsher droughts in summer. Such variability would have further motivated large-scale interventions in the landscape, canal building, reservoirs, to protect crops. It is telling that the rise of the first true cities, such as Uruk, in the 4th millennium BC, corresponds to an era of challenging climate oscillations. Large populations could only be sustained by innovations in agriculture and water control. Indeed, scholars have noted that these early cities often featured massive communal projects, for example, excavation of long canals or the building of temple granaries to stockpile grain against shortages, which imply centralized direction. Another critical environmental factor was the geological and hydrological evolution of the region. In the deep past, during the last glacial period, the Persian Gulf was dry land. The coastline was far to the southeast. As the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, the Gulf gradually filled in. By around 6000 BC, 8,000 years ago, rising seas had drowned a vast low-lying plain at the mouth of Mesopotamia. Archaeologists estimate that a land area about the size of Great Britain was submerged under the Indian Ocean's inflow. This slow encroachment of the Persian Gulf would have displaced human groups living in that fertile plain. We can imagine early Holocene hunter-fisher communities retreating northward as the waters advanced. Some researchers have even hypothesized that the memory of this inundation influenced Mesopotamian flood myths, since a great flood truly did erase a once inhabitable land. In any case, the end result by the Ubaid period, 6th millennium BC, was that the southern Mesopotamian alluvium became the new coastline. Settlements now clustered along the marshes and river channels at the head of the Gulf. This geographic concentration likely increased population density in the habitable zones, forcing closer interaction and competition over resources. It also made river transport and communication easier between communities, which might have facilitated the growth of a shared culture and larger political units. Interestingly, as sea level stabilized in the mid-Holocene, the Tigris and Euphrates began to build out the delta with sediment. By the 3rd millennium BC, the Gulf coastline had moved somewhat outward again due to river deposition. Cities like Eridu and which may have been near the seaside in prehistory, were landlocked by historical times, surrounded by expansive irrigated plains. The dynamic shoreline changes meant that some areas alternated between wetland and dry land over centuries. Communities had to remain adaptable, draining marshes for farmland or relocating when waters shifted. Environmental change, whether sudden floods or gradual shifts, constantly challenged Mesopotamian societies to innovate technologically and socially. The development of complex irrigation networks, the allocation of canal water rights, the maintenance of levees, and the distribution of surplus grain in lean years all required an unprecedented degree of organization. This laid the groundwork for centralized institutions. Temples and palaces emerged as the hubs of coordination, and their officials, priests and proto-kings, as the decision-makers. In summary, the transformation from scattered Neolithic villages to centralized urban centers in Mesopotamia was catalyzed by environmental pressures. The unpredictability of floods and droughts, coupled with post-Ice Age geological changes, created problems that no small kin-based village could solve alone. The solution was to band together under stronger leadership, forming larger communities, the first cities, bound by common infrastructure projects and shared divinities. Sumerian mythology, by having the gods lower kingship from heaven at the dawn of cities, offers a theological explanation for what was, on a material level, a pragmatic necessity. In effect, nature's challenges gave rise to kings. The grandeur attributed to Alulim's reign can be read as a reflection of this idea, that civilization began when a divinely guided leader first united the people to impose order on the waters and the wild. As early Mesopotamian communities grappled with their demanding environment, they developed a suite of technological and social innovations to survive and prosper. Foremost among these was irrigation agriculture. By channeling river water through canals and ditches, farmers could extend cultivation into the arid plains beyond the natural riverbanks. The archaeological record shows that simple irrigation was practiced by the Ubaid period, 5th millennium BC, and became extensive in the Uruk period, 4th millennium BC. This was not just a matter of digging a few trenches, it entailed large-scale earthworks, canal excavation, construction of feeder channels, diversion of river flow by weirs or gates, and maintenance of the entire system. Such tasks demanded the coordinated labor of many people and forward planning across the agricultural calendar. The process of constructing and maintaining irrigation networks led directly to the rise of organized labor and bureaucratic oversight. In the earliest cities, the central temple likely acted as an economic and administrative center. Sumerian temples owned large tracts of land and oversaw grain storage and distribution. To manage irrigation, temple officials mobilized communal labor, a system sometimes called corvée, where citizens contributed work rather than taxes. Workers had to be fed and supplied, schedules had to be arranged, all of which spurred record-keeping and administration. Indeed, the earliest known writing, circa 3200 BC, from Uruk, consists of economic and administrative texts. Lists of workers, allocations of grain, counts of livestock, etc., often incised on clay tablets as part of temple accounts. This early writing, proto-cuneiform, was essentially a bureaucratic tool, born from the need to keep track of labor and resources in an increasingly complex economy. The scale of irrigation systems expanded over time. By the early dynastic period, 3rd millennium BC, some canals were many kilometers long, watering fields of multiple villages or an entire city-state. Excavations and surveys in Iraq have discovered remains of ancient canal beds and levees crisscrossing the plains. One study of ancient irrigation in southern Mesopotamia found a vast network of canals, suggesting a lost world of advanced water management in the prehistoric era. The coordination to build these would have been immense. This is where strong leadership became crucial. A charismatic or forceful leader could organize hundreds of people to dig a canal before the planting season, or rally the populace to reinforce levees when floodwaters threatened. Such leadership eventually took institutional form, the emergence of kingship and state apparatus. Mesopotamian states developed officials, overseers and scribes, a whole hierarchy under the king or city governor, ensi, to administer large projects and manage resources. For example, there were officials in charge of canal maintenance, fields, livestock, and granaries, all of whom kept accounts. The Sumerians pioneered systems of standard measures and labor accounting to facilitate this. One document from later in the 3rd millennium, from the city of Lagash, even records how many workers and workdays were required to dredge certain canals. From such evidence, we see the lineaments of bureaucracy taking shape, rules for how work is allocated, how much barley ration each worker earns, and so forth. It is no coincidence that royal inscriptions of early kings often brag about irrigation achievements. Many kings of Sumer took titles like Builder of the Canal X, or commemorated the digging of new waterways on foundation stones. This suggests that political legitimacy was tied to the king's success in providing water and averting disaster. A king who could claim to have made the desert bloom by irrigation or to have saved his city from a flood would be esteemed as a true shepherd of his people, echoing the divine mandate bestowed on Alulim. Conversely, failure to control the waters could be seen as divine displeasure. The organization of labor for irrigation and construction was likely one of the primary drivers for the formation of laws and governance. The earliest law codes, for example, the Code of Ur-Nammu, circa 2100 BC, or later Hammurabi's laws, include provisions about water, laws against neglecting canal upkeep, penalties for letting one's fields flood a neighbor's land, etc. This indicates how central water management was to society's functioning. Strong central authority could enforce such rules and mediate disputes. We also see the rise of social stratification intertwined with these developments. There emerged a class of administrators and priests who planned and supervised work, in contrast to the farmers and laborers who executed it. Over time, the palace, secular authority, and temple, religious economic authority, became the twin pillars of Sumerian city-states, often working hand in hand. A text from ancient Lagash, for example, describes how allocations of grain were made from the temple granary to support crews digging a canal under the governor's oversight, a vivid snapshot of temple and state collaboration in public works. It is worth noting that the need for coordination was not only within a city, but between communities. Water does not respect settlement boundaries, and a canal might begin near one town and end near another. Thus, cooperation or conflict in water sharing could extend across an entire region. This likely encouraged the formation of larger political units, coalitions of towns or early kingdoms, under a single ruler who could enforce cooperation or conquer and command it. We might view the legendary kings like Alulim and his successors as archetypes of just such leaders, those who first unified multiple settlements under one rulership for the common good of water management and defense. While Alulim's reign in myth is fantastically long, in historical reality, the process of centralization was gradual, unfolding over many centuries. But by the early dynastic period, circa 2900 to 2500 BC, Sumer was a patchwork of city-states, each ruled by a king, lugal, or governor. And within each city-state, the capital city exerted control over surrounding villages and fields. This political landscape was the end product of the earlier developments in irrigation and labor organization. In summary, the challenges of feeding large populations in the fickle Mesopotamian environment led to innovations that were as social as they were technological. Irrigation agriculture increased food production but required large-scale cooperation. This, in turn, fostered central leadership and bureaucratic administration. The burgeoning apparatus of overseers, scribes, and officials marks the rise of the first bureaucratic states. Therefore, while mythology frames the beginning of civilization in terms of gods and kings, the material record suggests that behind those legends was a very concrete impetus: the hydraulic management of the land. It is no surprise that later thinkers like Aristotle and modern scholars like Karl Wittfogel have characterized Mesopotamian civilization as a hydraulic society, one fundamentally shaped by the control of water. Although that model has its limits, it underscores a truth: strong leadership and complex organization in Sumer arose as a direct response to environmental and agricultural needs, allowing cities and civilization to take root where simple villages once stood. To fully appreciate the rise of early Mesopotamian civilization, one must also consider the geological changes that reconfigured the landscape at the end of the Ice Age and into the early Holocene. These changes had profound effects on where people could live and how they needed to cooperate. As mentioned earlier, the Persian Gulf Basin was once dry land. During the last glacial maximum, circa 18,000 years ago, global sea levels were much lower, and the combined Tigris-Euphrates River probably flowed through a valley where the Gulf now lies. This Persian Gulf plain would have been an extension of Mesopotamia, likely a rich environment for human groups, often termed the Gulf Oasis by some researchers. After the Ice Age, however, melting polar ice caused sea levels to rise worldwide, and by around 8,000 years ago, 6,000 BC, the ocean had inundated the Gulf plain completely. What had been a broad expanse of habitable land gradually shrank, swallowed up by the Indian Ocean, in the words of one report. The flooding of the Gulf displaced human communities that had lived there in the earlier Neolithic period. While we have scant archaeological data from under the sea, it's hypothesized that those groups moved upstream into the upper Gulf Coast and river valleys. The result would have been a convergence of populations into a smaller area of dry land. As sea level rise slowed and stabilized, after 6000 BC, the new coastline, near what is now southern Iraq, became dotted with wetlands and estuaries teeming with fish and fowl, a attractive resources for settlers. It is likely no coincidence that the earliest known Ubaid period villages in southern Mesopotamia, circa 6500 to 5000 BC, cluster near ancient watercourses not far from the Paleo coastline. This suggests an influx of people adapting to the changing environment. Greater population density can often spur greater social complexity. More people in competition and contact can accelerate innovation and necessitate rules or leadership to manage conflicts. Another effect of post-glacial change was the development of extensive marshes in southern Iraq. As the two great rivers reached the flat plain, they slowed and deposited sediments, creating marshy, deltaic conditions. These marshes, wetlands, were a distinctive ecological zone, rich in resources like reeds for building, fish, birds, and wild game. They also posed unique challenges. Living in a marsh required building homes on platforms or mounds, using boats for transport, and clearing land for any agriculture. The people of the Ubaid culture appear to have been adept at exploiting marsh resources and gradually turning swamps into farmland by draining or redirecting water. The legendary first city, Eridu, was founded at the edge of a freshwater marsh near the coast, according to geological investigations. Ancient Mesopotamian stories even remember a time when Eridu was surrounded by primeval waters, a likely nod to its marshy origins and to the god Enki's dominion over the watery deep. The encroachment of the Gulf and the presence of marshlands meant that communal efforts were needed not only to irrigate, but also to reclaim land. Early settlers had to work together to build up mud platforms to raise village sites above flood level, dig canals to drain waterlogged areas, and cooperate in fishing and boating ventures. The marsh environment could isolate communities unless they coordinated via waterways. We might see here another push towards social cohesion and organized leadership. A village that could organize effective fishing parties or reed harvesting expeditions, for instance, would thrive better than one where every family went its own way. Over generations, these local leaders or councils handling marsh and water issues could have evolved into formal chieftains or kings. Importantly, as sedimentation continued over centuries, the Tigris-Euphrates delta advanced outward. By the early dynastic period, 3rd millennium BC, the Persian Gulf shoreline had moved further south. Cities like which might have been near the sea in Ubaid times, were now inland. This progradation of the delta created new dry land, but also shifted the courses of river channels. Periodically, rivers would change course or silt up, forcing entire canal systems to be rerouted. The archaeological record shows instances of canals falling out of use and new ones being dug as rivers moved. Such hydrological disruptions could be ruinous if not managed. A city could be left without water if a river shifted too far. Here again, the value of a strong centralized authority becomes evident. Only a coordinated effort by a city's rulers and population could, for example, dig a massive new canal to connect to a diverted river. The alternative might be the abandonment of the city. Indeed, some ancient cities were eventually depopulated when irrigation failed or when the local environment became too degraded, e.g., salt accumulation in soils. The lesson driven home repeatedly was that collective action and leadership were essential for survival in the face of geological and environmental flux. We should also consider the broader post-Ice Age climate trends. After the initial warm-up, there were notable aridification events in Mesopotamia. One around 6200 BC, a cold, dry snap, and another much later around 2200 BC, a severe drought linked to the Akkadian Empire's collapse. During drier periods, the habitable zones would contract toward reliable water sources, rivers and well-managed canals, concentrating populations. Conversely, during wetter phases, agriculture could expand outward. These oscillations put a premium on flexible social organization. The societies that could rapidly mobilize labor to extend canals in good times or to deepen existing channels in drought times were more likely to endure. In sum, the geological and climatic backdrop of early Mesopotamia was one of dramatic change. Seas rising, rivers shifting, marshes forming and receding. These changes pressed human communities into tighter quarters and simultaneously provided both bountiful opportunities, fertile silt, fish, transport routes, and daunting obstacles, floods, swamps, water scarcity. The net effect was to amplify the need for cooperative structures and visionary leadership. Alulim and his successors in myth can be seen as personifications of this principle, the idea that only by rallying together under a divinely appointed leader could humans master the capricious land and water. It is telling that later, Mesopotamian art and literature often depict kings performing hydraulic feats, like digging the first canal, at the god's behest, almost as if echoing real memories of the feats that turned floodplain wilderness into the cradle of civilization. While Sumerians, speakers of the Sumerian language, a linguistic isolate, are credited with creating the first cities and much of Mesopotamian high culture, they did not develop in isolation. From very early on, they interacted with Semitic-speaking peoples who also inhabited Mesopotamia, especially the northern and western regions. The term Semitic here refers to a language family, which includes Akkadian, Eblate, Amorite, later Babylonian and Assyrian dialects, etc., rather than a specific ethnicity, but these peoples likely originated from the Syro-Arabian deserts and the upper Mesopotamian plains. By the 3rd millennium BC, and possibly even in late prehistoric times, Sumerians and Semitic Akkadians lived side by side in Mesopotamia and formed a very intimate cultural symbiosis, as modern scholars describe it. This symbiosis included widespread bilingualism. Many inhabitants of Mesopotamian cities could understand both Sumerian and Akkadian, and words and ideas flowed between the languages freely. The contributions of Semitic-speaking peoples to Sumerian civilization were significant on multiple levels: linguistic, cultural, political, and religious. By 2500 BC, we find personal names in the royal and administrative records of Sumerian cities that are Semitic, Akkadian in origin, indicating that Akkadian speakers had become integrated at high levels of society. For example, some kings of Kish, a northern Mesopotamian city traditionally on the fringe of Sumer, bore Semitic names, and the title King of Kish came to be used as a prestigious epithet, even by Sumerian kings, perhaps because Kish had a reputation as a conduit of northern Semitic power. This mixing is also evident in material culture. Cylinder seals, art motifs, and technical innovations show a blend of Sumerian and Akkadian influences during the early dynastic period. One of the greatest contributions of the Semitic Akkadians was in the realm of empire and administration. The world's first empire is attributed to Sargon of Akkad, circa 2334 BC, a Semitic Akkadian ruler who conquered all of Sumer and beyond, uniting northern and southern Mesopotamia under one rule. Sargon's dynasty, the Akkadian Empire, created a template for later Mesopotamian states. They preserved and propagated Sumerian culture, even as they infused it with their own. Notably, Sargon's daughter, Enheduanna, became a high priestess in Ur and is famed as the earliest known poet. She composed hymns in Sumerian to the goddess Inanna, Ishtar, reflecting a conscious effort to merge Sumerian religious traditions with Akkadian ones. This period likely saw the canonization of many Sumerian myths and epics. Though Sumerian was gradually being replaced by Akkadian as a spoken tongue by 2000 BC, it remained the language of scholarship and liturgy. The Semitic peoples, therefore, acted as transmitters and transformers of Sumerian civilization. During the Old Babylonian period, around 18th to 17th centuries BC, scribes in Babylon and other cities copied Sumerian literature, ensuring its survival for millennia. In fact, the majority of Sumerian mythological literature known to historians today comes from the Old Babylonian period, in the form of tablets that preserve Sumerian texts and their Akkadian translations. The famous Epic of Gilgamesh, though originally a Sumerian tale, was handed down to us largely through Akkadian, Babylonian versions. Thus, a major Semitic contribution was the preservation and expansion of the Sumerian literary and intellectual legacy. Semitic peoples also enriched Sumerian civilization through innovation and syncretism. For example, the Akkadians introduced new military strategies and equipment. They are often credited with spreading the use of composite bows and true chariots in Mesopotamia. They also brought different artistic styles and perhaps new forms of music or folklore. Linguistically, Sumerian borrowed terms from Akkadian, especially in areas of warfare, herding, and commerce, and vice versa. Akkadian absorbed a great many Sumerian words, particularly for technical and religious concepts. This two-way exchange indicates a deep integration of communities. Scholars often describe late 3rd millennium Mesopotamia as a bilingual society or a Sprachbund, a linguistic union. A scribe might write a royal inscription in Sumerian to honor tradition and write administrative orders in Akkadian for practical use, all within the same kingdom. Culturally and religiously, syncretism accelerated as Semitic groups gained prominence. By the time of the Old Babylonian Kingdom, under the Amorite dynasty, 18th century BC, a pan-Mesopotamian culture had emerged. The Babylonians, who were Semitic speakers, inheritors of Akkadian, retained Sumerian and Akkadian languages for sacred purposes, but they also reshaped the pantheon. Most famously, they elevated Marduk, a Babylonian national god, to the head of the pantheon, effectively displacing the older Sumerian chief deity Enlil. This theological shift is enshrined in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, which drew on earlier Sumerian creation themes but re-centered them on Marduk. In that process, Sumerian gods were syncretized with Semitic ones, e.g. Inanna became identified with Ishtar as two names for the same goddess, one Sumerian and one Semitic. Enki was identified with Ea, his Akkadian name, Utu with Shamash, Nanna with Sin, and so on. Rather than wiping away Sumerian religion, the Semitic Babylonians wove it into their own, blending traditions to form a continuous religious culture. New myths were composed that combined elements of both. For instance, the Atrahasis flood myth and the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, both in Akkadian, clearly have roots in Sumerian stories, but were adapted for new audiences and new theological emphases. Socially, Semitic-speaking peoples contributed a pastoralist element to Mesopotamian society. Many Semitic groups, like the Amorites and earlier nomadic Akkadian tribes, had traditions of nomadic herding, raising sheep, goats, camels in the steppe. When they migrated or infiltrated into Sumerian areas, they introduced this pastoral lifestyle as a counterpoint to the sedentary farming culture of Sumer. The tension and synergy between nomads and farmers became a recurring theme in Mesopotamian history, as we will explore through literature in the next section. Over time, integration occurred. Nomadic leaders settled down and became kings of cities, as with some Amorite chieftains who became rulers of Babylon, Mary, etc., but they often brought their tribal customs and vigor with them. This infusion may have made the Mesopotamian urban society more militarily robust, since nomadic peoples excelled in horsemanship and mobile warfare, and also broadened the cultural outlook. For example, West Semitic Amorites introduced new West Semitic deities like Adad, Hadad, the storm god, who was soon worshipped alongside Sumerian gods. In conclusion, the Sumerian civilization was never purely Sumerian. It was a melting pot that from early on included Semitic contributions. By 2000 BC, one could speak of a Sumero-Akkadian civilization in Mesopotamia. A scholarly summary puts it well. During the 3rd millennium BC, there developed a very intimate cultural symbiosis between the Sumerians and the Akkadians. The influence of Sumerian on Akkadian, and vice versa, is evident in all areas. The Semitic peoples, through their languages and traditions, helped carry Mesopotamian culture forward, ensuring its continuity even after Sumerian as a spoken language died out around the end of the 3rd millennium. In the grand scheme, early Mesopotamian civilization was a fusion of peoples, and its vitality came from this diversity. Without the Akkadians and other Semitic groups, Sumer's legacy might not have been preserved and transmitted as it was. Conversely, without inheriting Sumer's foundational achievements, the Semitic Babylonians and Assyrians could not have reached the heights they did. The story of Alulim and his successors, therefore, belongs not only to Sumer, but to all the peoples of Mesopotamia who inherited that story and kept its memory alive. According to Sumerian tradition, Eridu, modern Tel Abu Shahrain, was the very first city ever built. Located in the extreme south of Mesopotamia, near the head of the Persian Gulf, Eridu loomed large in Mesopotamian consciousness as a place of primeval beginnings. It is no coincidence that Eridu is the city where Alulim became king in the Sumerian King List. Eridu's status as the first city is reinforced by Sumerian creation myths and theology. One important text, often called the Eridu Genesis, composed in Sumerian with fragments dating to circa 1600 BC, explicitly describes the founding of the first cities by the gods. In this myth, after the creation of humans, the goddess Ni'intur, also known as Nin-Hersag or Ninma, a mother goddess, decides to civilize humanity. She calls humans from their nomadic life to build cities and temples, instructing them to settle down and become agrarian. The Eridu Genesis then recounts how kingship and organized life were introduced. Nintur was still planning to provide kingship and organization to humans. Then the first cities are named, beginning with Eridu, whose leadership Nintur placed under Enki. We see here a clear theological statement. Eridu is named first, the premier city, and its governance is given to the god Enki, the wise god of water, crafts, and creation. This accords with other sources, since Enki was the patron deity of Eridu. His great temple, called the Eabzu, stood at Eridu and was revered as one of the oldest shrines. The placement of Eridu at the top of the list of cities in the myth, followed by other ancient cities like Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, closely parallels the list in the King List of antediluvian cities. The theological import is that urban life and kingship were part of the divine plan for humanity. Eridu was the prototype. It was at Eridu that the gods first established a model of civilized existence, with a king, Alulim, and a functioning society under divine guidance. Notably, the Eridu Genesis also tells how these early cities were distributive economies, meaning goods were distributed by the temple or authorities, not by money or private markets. This reflects the memory of a time when the temple and palace controlled resources, which indeed matches what we know of early cities like Eridu and Uruk, often called temple economies. Thus, Eridu in myth symbolizes the inception of organized sacred society, people living in a city, honoring the gods in a temple, ruled by a king, and dividing labor and food in an orderly way. Another aspect of Eridu's significance is its association with creation and wisdom. Enki of Eridu was a creator and culture-bringer god. In one Sumerian tale, Enki and the goddess Ninma together create humans out of clay. In others, Enki helps humans by gifting them the arts of civilization. He is said to have given kings the meh, or divine decrees of authority and craft. Because Enki's city was Eridu, later Mesopotamians viewed Eridu as a holy city where the seeds of culture were sown. Some later Babylonian documents even refer to Eridu's temple as the place where the orders of heaven and earth were first decreed. We might liken Eridu's place in Mesopotamian thought to how later traditions view Eden or the first city of humanity, a place both real and mythic, where gods walked among men. Indeed, at Eridu, archaeological excavations have uncovered a long stratigraphy of temples built one atop the other, going back to at least the 6th millennium BC, Ubaid period, a fact that likely inspired later generations to consider it the oldest shrine on earth. The role of Marduk becomes relevant when we consider how later, Babylonian, theology appropriated and reinterpreted these early traditions. Marduk was a Babylonian deity who, by around 1500 BC, had been elevated to the head of the pantheon in Babylonia. In Babylon's national epic, the Enuma Elish, circa 1100 BC or earlier, Marduk is portrayed as the hero who defeats chaos, the dragon Tiamat, and then creates the ordered world. While the Enuma Elish focuses on Marduk establishing Babylon as the preeminent city, since it was composed to glorify Babylon, there is evidence in revised or later Babylonian texts that Marduk's creative role was expanded to align with older First City traditions. Notably, some Mesopotamian scholars in the 1st millennium BC syncretized Marduk with Enki, Ea. They regarded Marduk as Enki's heir, or even identified Marduk as a form of Enki. By doing so, they effectively inserted Marduk into the creation narrative of Eridu. One late text cited by historians states that Marduk also created the first city, Eridu. In other words, Babylonians, who saw Marduk as the supreme creator, claimed that it was Marduk, under the name Ea, or in his capacity as Enki's successor, who established Eridu at the very beginning of time. This theological maneuver served to connect Babylon's god to the most ancient sacred city. If Eridu was where kingship and civilization began, under Enki's guidance, and if Marduk is effectively Enki in a new form, then Marduk can be credited with humanity's first city. This gave Babylon, Marduk's city, an implicit legitimacy. Marduk had been there at the start, in Eridu, and now rightfully ruled in Babylon. We see an example of this linkage in the prologue to the Code of Hammurabi, 18th century BC, where Hammurabi mentions that Marduk had established him to rule and had organized the world, with Ea, Enki, as Marduk's father, who had given Marduk knowledge. Over time, Babylonian scribes produced god lists and syncretic hymns that explicitly equated Marduk with Asaluhi, a local name for Enki's son at Eridu, and made Marduk the son of Ea. This became canonical. Thus, in later theology, Eridu's heritage was effectively inherited by Babylon via Marduk's ascent. The founding myth of Eridu and its theological significance can also be viewed through a broader lens. It established a pattern that each great Mesopotamian city tried to emulate. Just as Eridu was first and had the blessing of the gods, cities like Nippur, Uruk, and Babylon each fashioned narratives of divine favor and ancient origins. For example, Nippur claimed to be the bond between heaven and earth, where Enlil decreed destinies, and Babylon's priests claimed their city was planned in the heavens. Yet, Eridu remained a touchstone for antiquity. Even when Eridu had long declined politically, by the second millennium it was no longer a major capital. Its name evoked the ideal of a divinely established city. Theologians listed it among the 5 antediluvian cities, and its temple of Enki was periodically renovated by kings who wanted to associate themselves with the ancient past. In sum, Eridu's theological significance lies in its portrayal as the birthplace of urban life and kingship. It was the place where kingship was lowered from heaven and thus sanctified all later centers of power. By including Eridu and Alulim at the start of the King List and myths, the Sumerians effectively said, "Our civilization began in Eridu by the will of the gods. What we have now is a continuation of that divine beginning." When later Babylonians invoke Marduk's role in creation and even claim he built Eridu, they are paying homage to that legacy and simultaneously reasserting it under their own patron deity. Therefore, Alulim's Eridu and Marduk's Babylon are bridged in the theological imagination, one as the alpha and the other as a kind of omega of Mesopotamian sacred history, each city's myth reinforcing the notion that kingship and civilization are gifts from the gods to humanity. The Sumerians left behind not only king lists and creation epics, but also a rich corpus of poetry and myth that often contain surprising social commentary. One recurring theme in their literature is the tension and complementarity between pastoral nomads and settled agriculturalists, essentially herders versus farmers. This likely reflects real social dynamics in ancient Mesopotamia. Alongside the urban farming population, there always existed nomadic or semi-nomadic groups, often of West Semitic origin, like the Martu-Ses Amorites, who lived by herding flocks in the steppe and who sometimes interacted with or even raided the farm villages. The economic interdependence and occasional conflict between these lifestyles made its way into myth in allegorical form. A prime example is a Sumerian poem often called The Wooing of Inanna, also known in modern publications as Dumuzi and Enkimdu, or Inanna Prefers the Farmer. In this tale, the goddess Inanna, patron of love, fertility, and war, and also the deification of the storehouse and dates, indicating both love and prosperity, is courted by 2 suitors, Dumuzi, the shepherd god, and Enkidu, the farmer god. Dumuzi represents the nomadic herder tradition. He is associated with shepherds and seasonal flock migrations. Enkidu represents the sedentary farmer, tied to the soil, the canals, and the cycle of planting and harvest. The myth unfolds as a kind of debate or contest between the two males for Inanna's favor. Notably, Inanna's brother Utu, the sun god, initially advocates on behalf of Dumuzi, trying to persuade Inanna to choose the shepherd over the farmer. The text, in dialogue form, showcases the merits of each occupation. Enkidu the farmer offers bread, beer, and stable farm produce. Dumuzi the shepherd boasts of milk, wool, and livestock abundance. In one version of the story, Inanna at first leans towards Enkidu, finding his calm, reliable provision appealing. He can bring her grain and flax, symbolizing a settled life. Dumuzi, however, is brash and aggressive. He extols his wealth in sheep and dairy, his dynamism, and even derides the farmer as being dependent on what the shepherd provides: manure for fertilizer, wool for garments, etc. Dumuzi's charismatic plea apparently sways the outcome. Inanna ultimately chooses Dumuzi, the shepherd, to be her husband, while Enkidu amiably steps aside, even promising to provide Dumuzi with some of his own goods as a goodwill gesture. In the myth's conclusion, Enkidu wanders away after yielding, and Dumuzi and Inanna unite. This tale is widely interpreted as symbolic of the reconciliation between pastoralists and farmers in Sumerian society. Rather than an outright hostile conflict, it suggests a negotiation of roles. The shepherd wins the bride, Inanna, who could be seen as the embodiment of the land's fertility, but the farmer does not become an enemy. Instead, he cooperates, indicating an understanding that both herding and farming are needed for prosperity. Indeed, in practical terms, ancient Mesopotamian economies required both. Flocks provided wool, meat, milk, and were mobile wealth. Farms provided grain, vegetables, and were fixed assets. The marriage of Inanna and Dumuzi itself became a cornerstone of Sumerian ritual, the sacred marriage ceremony, in which the king, playing Dumuzi, would ritually mate with a high priestess, playing Inanna, to renew the land's fertility each year. It is intriguing that the king is identified with the shepherd god, even though kings ruled cities of farmers. This might imply that the Sumerians valued the vigorous, expansive spirit of the nomad as a vital complement to the settled life. In myth, Dumuzi the shepherd eventually meets a tragic fate, dying and resurrecting seasonally, linked to vegetation cycles. But Enkidu the farmer is a static character. The dynamism is with the shepherd, possibly reflecting how infusion of nomadic tribes, like periodic Amorite influxes, brought new energy and sometimes turmoil to Mesopotamian civilization. Other Sumerian debate poems take a similar form. There are disputations between summer and winter, grain and sheep, tree and reed, etc. The debate between grain and sheep is especially parallel to the Inanna story in that grain, representing farming, and sheep, representing herding, argue over who is more important for the gods and for human welfare. The resolution in that tale is that both are needed. The gods decree that grain and sheep should cooperate, as each provides essential goods, bread and wool, respectively. Thus, Sumerian literature reveals an acute awareness of class and occupational tensions, yet it often resolves them by affirming a kind of complementarity ordained by the gods. Nevertheless, the tension was real. The image of the nomadic Martu in Sumerian texts was sometimes negative. Pastoral nomads are described in one text as people who know no houses, know no temples, who eat raw meat, who have no stable dwelling. This reflects the city dwellers' disdain or fear of the unruly steppe people. One king of Shulgi, even bragged about building a great wall to keep out the Martu, Amorites. On the flip side, nomadic groups viewed the cities as both opportunities for trade and sources of oppression or soft targets for raiding. The wooing of Inanna can be read in part as a political allegory. Inanna, as goddess of Uruk, a city, initially prefers the steady farmer, i.e., a vision of stable agrarian life, but ultimately is persuaded by the bold shepherd, suggesting that the rulers of Uruk saw advantage in allying with or adopting the ways of the herder. Historically, indeed, many ruling dynasties in Mesopotamia hailed from tribal semi-nomadic backgrounds, including the dynasty of Hammurabi of Babylon, who was an Amorite. Thus, the myth might presage how the shepherds would come to take over the cities, marrying into the culture, so to speak. One can also view the story through a class lens. Herders and farmers were like two economic classes that needed each other. The farmer was tied to one spot, vulnerable to local crop failures. The herder was mobile, could drive flocks to greener pastures when local ones were depleted, and could trade wool or animals for grain. In years of drought, farmers might rely on animal products. In years of plenty, herders might purchase surplus barley. The Sumerians, recognizing this interdependence, encoded it in the marriage of their goddess to a shepherd king. That even the headstrong Inanna had to be convinced suggests there was some reluctance or struggle involved, perhaps echoing how difficult it was for settled communities to accept nomadic leaders, and vice versa. Sumerian literature, like the Wooing of Inanna, provides a window into the social tensions of early Mesopotamia. It artfully personifies the age-old friction between the pastoral and agrarian ways of life. By resolving the friction through union, Inanna marrying Dumuzi, the myth conveys an aspirational message, that harmony can be achieved between these modes of existence and that such harmony is beneficial to the fertility of the land and the favor of the gods. We see in these stories an acknowledgement that Mesopotamian civilization was a tapestry woven from different lifeways, and that even at the mythic origin of things, there was a need to balance the wild and the tame, the mobile and the settled. This balance, once struck, is what allowed society to prosper. Having explored the many facets of early Mesopotamian civilization, from its divine kings and environmental challenges to its cultural fusions and internal social dynamics, we circle back to Alulim, the first king, and what he ultimately symbolizes. Alulim and the other antediluvian kings of the Sumerian King List serve as archetypal figures at the dawn of history. They are less important as individuals, indeed they blur into myth, than as symbols for the Sumerians' understanding of how civilization began. Firstly, Alulim embodies the idea of order emerging from chaos. In the primeval times, human beings were seen as living in a chaotic state, like animals, as the etymology of Alulim's name, stag's horn, hints. The coming of kingship under Alulim represents the imposition of cosmos, order, structure, onto this chaos. That order was divinely sanctioned, suggesting that the Sumerians believed the very concept of an organized city-state was a gift from the gods to protect humanity from a feral existence. In many civilizations, there are myths of a culture hero or first ruler who brings laws or inventions, for example, Egypt's Osiris or China's Yellow Emperor. Alulim fits this pattern for Mesopotamia. He is the culture hero in kingly form, to whom later kings could look back and say, "We follow in his footsteps as he followed the god's mandate." Secondly, the extraordinary lengths of reign attributed to Alulim and his successors, tens of thousands of years, lend these figures a timeless, immortal quality. This suggests that the Sumerians conceived of the earliest era of civilization as a golden age when kings were quasi-divine and the normal rules of life and death did not fully apply. By the time of Gilgamesh, who was said to be two-thirds divine and who only reigned 126 years in the King List, human rulers had become more mortal. So Alulim stands at the far end of the spectrum, almost eternal, shrouded in the mists before the flood. Such depiction likely gave a sense of depth and gravity to Mesopotamian history. Their kingship wasn't a recent human invention, but something rooted in the very beginning of time, connected to near-immortal predecessors. It legitimized contemporary kings as inheritors of an ancient, unbroken chain of authority that stretched back to mythical antiquity. For example, royal inscriptions might invoke the kings of old who ruled for thousands of years, to compare a current king's piety or strength to those legendary standards. Moreover, Alulim's association with Eridu cemented the idea that civilization began at a specific sacred location and moment. The flood that follows the reigns of those antediluvian kings, notably, then the flood swept over, ends the King List's first section, provides a narrative breakpoint, a destruction and restart. Alulim and the others become symbols of antediluvian wisdom, sometimes referenced in later texts. For instance, Babylonian lore about the 7 sages, Apkallu, who advised the ancient kings, often ties the first sage, Uwana, or Adapa, a fishman creature of wisdom, to the time of the first king, Aloros Alulim. This is very suggestive. It means that later Mesopotamians believed that when kingship began with Alulim, the gods also sent down wisdom in the form of sages to help humans. Alulim thus symbolizes not just political order, but also the infusion of divine knowledge, agriculture, art, writing, rituals, basically all the elements of civilized life. In mythic terms, one could say Alulim's reign is when humans truly became human, rising above the animal state through divine guidance. The broader symbolic role of these earliest kings is also as exemplars of ideal kingship. Mesopotamian political ideology in historical times held the king to a high standard. He should be the protector of his city, the provider of justice, the shepherd of his people, beloved of the gods. The legends of early kings gave paradigms for these roles. Alulim is less fleshed out in narrative than some later heroes like Etana, the post-flood king who flew to heaven on an eagle, or Gilgamesh, but merely being the first carries symbolic weight. Some later sources, as noted, make poetic reference to years of Alulim as a blessing. To wish someone years of Alulim was to wish them a supernaturally long, prosperous life. This shows how Alulim became a byword for longevity and prosperity granted by the gods. Likewise, Alulim being specifically chosen by the gods among the many people underscores the ideal that the true king is divinely chosen, not just self-appointed. Kings in historical Mesopotamia often underwent rituals of selection or had origin myths where a god or goddess pronounced favor upon them, e.g., Sargon of Akkad's legend of being rescued and chosen by Ishtar. All such motifs hark back to the template of Alulim, the paradigmatic chosen shepherd. One can also analyze how the story of Alulim and his era functioned in Sumerian cultural memory. By anchoring the origin of civilization in a mythic time, the Sumerians created a sense of identity and continuity. They saw themselves as part of a grand story that began in Eridu, carried through the flood, continued in each dynasty, and was sustained by the grace of the gods. In periods of upheaval or foreign domination, this deep historical consciousness could be particularly empowering. For instance, when Babylonian scholars compiled king lists or described the ancient past, they drew on Sumerian accounts to legitimize new regimes. The Sumerian King List itself may have been composed in part to legitimize the Asin dynasty around 1900 BC by claiming the mantle of past glories. Alulim's name on that list was a testament that we Mesopotamians have the oldest kingship on earth bestowed by heaven, a powerful theological claim vis-à-vis neighboring cultures. Finally, Alulim and those earliest kings stand as symbols of the origin of all institutions that define civilization: kingship, city building, temple worship, law and social order. Each segment of the king list or related myth can be seen as explaining how a particular innovation came to be. For example, the reign of Dumuzisid, the shepherd, another antediluvian king after Alulim, might mythologically signify the introduction of pastoralism into the royal paradigm. The reign of Enmendur-Ana of Sippar, another on the list, was linked in later tradition to the origin of divination and astronomy, since Sippar was associated with the sun god. Thus, each figure had a specialty, but Alulim, being the first, presided over the dawn of urban society itself. In conclusion, Alulim's broader symbolic role is as an embodiment of civilization's dawn. He is the first light after the figurative darkness of pre-civilization. Under his rule, in myth, humanity steps into a new age of cities, writing, agriculture, and organized religion, the pillars of what we call civilization. This is why Alulim remained a reference point for millennia in Mesopotamia. Whether or not a real chief of Eridu ever bore that name around 5000 BC, which we cannot know. For the Sumerians, it did not matter. Alulim was every first king, the prototype that cast the mold for all kings to follow. Just as Eridu was the first city that set the pattern for all cities, Alulim was the first king who set the standard, with divine favor, just rule, and stewardship for all future kings. In the grand narrative from chaos to order, from wild to settled, from barbarity to civilization, Alulim is the hinge figure where the change occurs. Through him, the Sumerians articulated their most fundamental values: reverence for the gods' guidance, the necessity of wise leadership, and the belief that kingship and culture are the gifts of heaven. From the legendary reign of Alulim in Eridu to the bustling cities of historical Sumer, we have traced how the Sumerians understood the origins of their civilization and the forces that shaped it. Myth and reality intertwine in this story. Mythically, civilization begins when the gods lower kingship from heaven, appointing Alulim as a shepherd king to lead humanity out of primordial chaos. Historically, we discern that civilization in Mesopotamia arose in response to environmental challenges: the need to tame floods, irrigate fields, and cooperate on a grand scale. The symbolism of Alulim's era encapsulates these truths. It credits the gods for instituting social order, but we can also read it as an allegory for early peoples coming together under leadership to overcome nature's trials. We examined how environmental pressures like flooding and drought necessitated centralized authority and innovative organization, driving the transformation from village life to urbanism. We saw that the building of canals and dikes was not just a technical feat, but a social revolution, the spark that ignited bureaucratic systems and state formation. Geological changes, including post-Ice Age sea level rise and shifting river courses, played a crucial role in concentrating populations and demanding cooperative solutions. In all these developments, strong leadership, often sacralized as divine kingship, was key. The Sumerians expressed this poetically by saying kingship came from heaven at the beginning of time, and by venerating figures like Alulim who epitomized those first rulers. Our exploration also highlighted the interplay of cultures. The Sumerians did not advance alone, but alongside and intertwined with Semitic peoples. This Sumero-Semitic symbiosis enriched the civilization, ensuring that Sumer's legacy, writing, law, literature, religion, was preserved and adapted through Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian hands. The founding myth of Eridu and its later Babylonian reinterpretation via Marduk demonstrate how successive generations rerouted themselves in that original narrative, claiming continuity with the first city and its divine sanction. Eridu, as a theological prototype of the holy city, influenced how every Mesopotamian city viewed itself. Each sought to be an Eridu under its patron deity, a center where heaven and earth meet. Moreover, the social tensions inherent in building civilization, notably between nomadic pastoralists and settled farmers, found expression in Sumerian literature and were resolved in principle through mythic unity, Inanna's marriage to the shepherd Dumuzi. This indicates a conscious understanding that harmony and cooperation between different ways of life were necessary for society's stability. Sumer's civilization was one of complementary forces: city and steppe, temple and palace, Sumerian and Semite, man and woman, as seen in the sacred marriage rite, all interlocking to form a greater whole. In the end, Alulim stands as a symbol of origins. Through him, the Sumerians conveyed that civilization is a deliberate creation, not an accident, but a project ordained by divine will and human effort. The early kings, with their giant spans of years, act as a bridge between the mortal and the divine, suggesting that in the beginning, the line between human and God was thin. Kingship was the conduit through which divine wisdom flowed to humanity. Alulim was thus imagined as both servant of the gods and benefactor of people. His very name, linked to an animal, then recorded as a king, hints at the transition of humanity from nature to culture. By studying the story and symbolism of Alulim and the world's first cities, we gain insight not only into ancient Mesopotamian beliefs, but into the universal questions that the Sumerians were asking. Where did our way of life come from? Who established the first laws and institutions? How did we learn to survive together? Their answer, that a God-chosen king led them under heaven's guidance, is both a reflection of their piety and a clever encoding of historical memory. It affirms that human beings, when faced with daunting challenges, found solutions collectively, under leadership that aimed, ideally, at the common good. In conclusion, the figure of Alulim and the myth surrounding early Sumer serve as a timeless reminder of the fragile miracle of civilization. They remind us that civilization had a beginning, a leap from an earlier mode of life, and that it was made possible by divine inspiration, wise leadership, and cooperative labor. The Sumerians cast that leap in the form of epic lists and legends. Through those, they passed down an enduring legacy, the idea that our organized world, with its cities and knowledge, is a precious inheritance from those first days when kings and gods established abundance and exalted the word of the god. Alulim, the first king, thus remains a potent emblem of humanity's first steps into civilization, steps taken hand in hand with the gods.